1983, a young woman named Barbara Grams was murdered in Tampa, Florida. Police said one detail on her body cracked the case open. A mark on her cheek they believed was a human bite. That supposed bite mark led them to an 18-year-old named Robert DuBoise. He was convicted. The jury recommended life. The judge sent him to death row anyway, and for decades the state treated that as justice. Then the case was reopened. The science was re-examined, DNA was tested, and the entire thing began to collapse. Because the man Florida condemned was innocent. What makes the Robert DuBoise case so disturbing is not just that the system got the wrong man. It's how ordinary the failure looks once you pull it apart. A shaky forensic claim becomes the centre of gravity. A jailhouse witness appears with a story that sounds useful. Missing disclosures stay missing. A theory hardens into certainty. And once that certainty takes hold, everything that does not fit gets pushed to the edges. This is the story of how a murder investigation turned into a machine and how it took 37 years to force that machine into reverse. Barbara Grams was 19 years old. She had been walking home from work when she was attacked and killed in August 1983. Investigators collected biological material, hair, fingerprints, and other evidence from the scene. But very quickly, enormous weight fell onto a single idea: that an injury on her cheek was a bite mark left by the killer. A local dentist first suggested it might have been made by someone with a missing front tooth or a noticeable gap. Another forensic dentist, Richard Souveron, later advised police to make suspect impressions using beeswax, a method that destroyed the original mould in the process. Early descriptions pointed one way. Then the investigation bent toward Robert DuBoise anyway, even though he did not have the kind of obvious dental gap investigators first claimed they were looking for. Police found DuBoise through a loose neighbourhood lead. He was young, local, already known to the system for minor, non-violent offences, and easy to pull into focus. He gave an impression of his teeth. Souveron said the mark on Barbara Grams' cheek came from DuBoise. That opinion became the spine of the case. But there was a problem sitting in plain sight from the beginning. Other physical evidence did not tie him to the crime scene. Fingerprints taken from the victim's wallet and a nearby air conditioner excluded DuBoise, his brother, and another man police were considering. Even so, once the bite mark theory locked in, the investigation moved as if the answer had already been chosen. At trial in 1985, the prosecution did not rely on bite mark testimony alone. It also used jailhouse informant testimony. A man named Claude Butler told police that DuBoise had confessed to him while both were housed in the jail's psychiatric section. Butler was facing extremely serious charges of his own. After cooperating, he received a much lighter outcome than the exposure he had originally faced. Another witness emerged shortly before trial claiming DuBoise had spoken about being wanted for murder. That witness was also working closely with prosecutors in another case, and that relationship was not disclosed to the defence. Meanwhile, the defence called an expert odontologist who said DuBoise should actually be excluded as the source of the supposed bite marks because the inconsistencies were too great. None of that was enough to stop the conviction. DuBoise was found guilty of murder and attempted sexual battery. The jury recommended life in prison. The judge overruled that recommendation and sentenced him to death. 3 years later, the death sentence was vacated and he was resentenced to life. But that was hardly a rescue. It just meant the state had traded one kind of cage for another. By then, the official version of the case had hardened. Robert DuBoise was the killer, and the bite mark had supposedly proved it. For For years, DuBoise kept insisting he was innocent. In 2006, he sought DNA testing, but the case was stuck in a legal swamp. Biological evidence was said to have been destroyed in 1990. Prosecutors also argued that because the crime may have involved more than one perpetrator, even evidence that excluded DuBoise would not necessarily prove innocence. That logic is bleak enough on its own. But the deeper shock came later when the case was re-examined and old assumptions began falling apart one by one. In 2018, the Innocence Project began representing DuBoise. The Hillsborough County Conviction Review Unit reopened the case in 2019. Investigators uncovered things the jury had never heard in their full shape. They found Butler's sentence had been reduced after his cooperation. They found problems with the late emerging witness, and most importantly, they took a fresh look at the forensic evidence that had anchored the whole prosecution. A modern forensic odontologist, Dr. Adam Freeman, concluded that Souveron's confident identification had no scientific basis. The preserved cheek tissue had been altered by formaldehyde. The beeswax process had distorted the impressions. And then came the most devastating point of all. The mark on Barbara Graham's cheek was not even a bite mark. Then the buried evidence surfaced. In 2020, 3 slides from the rape kit, long thought unavailable, were found at the medical examiner's office. DNA testing was finally done. Robert DuBoise was excluded. So were the other men from the old prosecution theory. The DNA profile instead pointed investigators towards 2 entirely different men. The state moved to reduce DuBoise' sentence to time served, and he walked out of prison in August 2020 after nearly 37 years behind bars. Weeks later, on September 14, 2020, the court vacated his conviction. According to Florida Senate materials summarising the case and the court's order, the court found there was no credible evidence of DuBoise' guilt and clear and convincing evidence of his innocence. That is not a technicality. That is a legal demolition. And the story did not end there. The DNA profiles from the case helped lead investigators to Amos Robinson and Abron Scott. Scott later pleaded guilty in 2024 and received 2 additional life sentences for the murder of Barbara Grams and Linda Lanson. Reporting in January 2026 said Robinson's case was moving towards trial. So this was never just a case where a conviction became uncertain. The evidence did not merely weaken the original prosecution, it pointed away from Robert DuBoise and towards other men. Even after exoneration, the punishment did not fully stop. Florida's compensation law initially blocked DuBoise from receiving standard exoneree compensation because of an unrelated minor non-violent conviction from his youth. The legislature later passed a claims bill awarding him $1.85 million, and in 2024, the Tampa City Council approved a $14 million settlement of his wrongful conviction lawsuit. DuBoise himself said the money could never restore what he lost. It is one of those lines that lands harder because it is so plain. No amount of money can give someone back his 20s, his 30s, his 40s. The funeral's missed, the birthdays erased, the ordinary years turned to dust inside a prison system that should never have had him. The Robert DuBoise case is a warning label on the side of the American justice system. It is about what happens when a forensic method gets dressed up as certainty before the science is there. It is about what happens when informant testimony is treated like gold even when the incentives are screaming from the page. It is about what happens when prosecutors fail to give the defence the full picture. And it is about how hard it is to unwind a conviction once the state has told itself a neat, satisfying story. Modern scientific reviews from NIST have said bite mark analysis lacks a sufficient scientific foundation. In other words, one of the pillars used to cage DuBoise for decades was never sturdy in the first place. Robert DuBoise walked into this story as an easy suspect. He walked out of it as living proof that wrongful convictions do not always come from one cartoonishly evil act. Sometimes they come from a chain of smaller failures that all lean the same direction until a human life disappears under the weight of them. Barbara Graham still deserves justice. Robert DuBoise deserves freedom. For 37 years, the system delivered neither. And that is what makes this case so haunting. It was not just a false conviction. It was justice split in two, with both halves dropped on the floor.